Greetings and welcome to Spade, the Japanese Navy. In this video I'll be going over the Japanese destroyers, the first ships in the Blue Water Tech Tree. Before I go over the ships, I'd like to talk about the changes to Naval and Update 2.5 Aqua Strike that I noticed myself during playing these ships. I am in no way the person you should trust for objectively telling you what changed. These are just my experiences and observations. First, high explosive seems to work differently from the previous patch. Now it seems to have a mild penetrating capability and much more situational damage output. I've personally noticed that they do less damage to angled ships compared to broadsiding ships when using high explosive. Another thing to take into account is the volatility of ammo and torpedo storage. These seem to be much more susceptible to damage than previously, with devastating results, especially the torpedo storage. These changes are something to get used to and might change again next update, but now onto the ships. We'll start at the beginning with the reserve Mutsuki. Sitting at 3.3, it is the start of the Blue Water Fleet and gets 3 spawns due to it being a reserve. A bit of a tangent, but I want to stress that Blue Water reserves don't have the BR of 1.0, as reserves do of any other tech tree. I've seen plenty of people bring out reserve coastal and Blue Water vessels in the same match, because I assume they think they're the same BR. They certainly aren't. The Mutsuki is armed with 4 120mm guns in 4 single mounts along the center line of the ship. These pack a good punch and have somewhat decent fire rate for the ready storage ammo. These guns are also noticeably the only main armament on any Japanese destroyer, with the choice of an armor-piercing shell in the form of semi-armor piercing. These will be needed against some armored coastal vessels. 3 of your 4 turrets have great angles towards the front of the ship and traverse to the frontal arc as well. This allows you to shoot the majority of your guns while being heavily angled and switch the engaged side relatively quickly. The only real downside being the traverse rate of these guns. I advise you to turn the entire ship if you're caught off guard by a sudden enemy. AA-wise, the Mutsuki has practically none, as it only has 2 7.7mm machine guns, one on each side of the bridge. These serve next to no purpose, so you should be very careful to look out for aerial threats. For the explosive ordnance, the Mutsuki gets a choice between 6 torpedoes with a full reload, 8 depth charges and 16 mines. The mines and depth charges are mutually exclusive. Depth charges for when you want to have more ammo storage for the enemy to detonate. Mines being sort of interesting but very limited as they disappear after a certain time after being deployed, this being 4 minutes I believe, which means getting kills with them or actually defending points with them is rather unreliable. Lastly, the torpedoes. Carrying an all-white payload of 480 kilos of TNT, without the torpedo modification these have a range of 7 km and a good top speed of 85 km an hour. Like this, the torpedoes have a much shorter time to target, but lack any kind of real long-range sniping capability. With the torpedo modification, the torpedoes get a range of 15 km, but go at a somewhat slow top speed of 65 km an hour. These are the torpedoes I personally use and equip on encounter missions to snipe some of the cargo ships. I advise either not taking torpedoes or dumping them quickly otherwise. Maneuverability-wise, the Mutsuki is quite agile and speedy with a top speed of 69 km an hour, allowing you to get in and out of position with relative ease. Survivability-wise, the Mutsuki doesn't stand out much but has some weak points. First, the torpedoes. These form a great hazard thanks to their volatility in 2.5 and are situated at the base of both smokestacks. Secondly, there's also a big ammo storage of the second turret. This one is noticeably above the waterline and between the 2 smokestacks. The same area as his torpedo storage, so if you ever need to destroy one, aim between the smokestacks. For playstyle, I suggest being as aggressive as you can, without unnecessarily endangering your vessel. As a reserve you get 3 spawns in the Mutsuki, so losing your vessel once isn't a major problem when spading it. Use your excellent frontal firing arcs to quickly close to your optimal range, and stay heavily angled to shrug off most of the enemy shells. You can use your speed to get to the capture point and use the possible threat of your good torpedoes to discourage any enemies from getting into close range fights with you. You'll want to avoid areas with a high threat of flanking coastal vessels, as you lack the secondary armament and primary gun handling to quickly deal with them. Pros: decent speed, good torpedoes, decent firepower. Cons: no real anti-air, vulnerable ammo, poor gun handling. Verdict: spade it. It's a reserve, so you don't really have the option to just skip Mutsuki, unless you buy a premium, but Mutsuki should be a fine destroyer to quickly spade. Next, the Ayanami. Sitting at 4.0 and armed with 6 127mm guns and 3 dual mounts on the center line of the ship, 2 at the rear and 1 at the front. The Ayanami is a shining example of what most other destroyers in the Japanese tree will be. These guns have the slowest rate of fire of any 127mm gun at the BR, only beating out the reload of the 135mm guns on the Italian Commandanti. The Japanese 127mm third-year type has the highest velocity shells of all 127mm guns, which allows you to comfortably engage from long range. The downside, however, is that no Japanese destroyer beyond this point gets any kind of armor-piercing shell. The only choice you have being between high explosive and high explosive times few shells. This leaves you a few options to counter heavily armored vessels like cruisers and up-tiers. For anti-air, the Ayanami gets two dual 13.2mm mounts located forward at the base of the second smoke funnel. While these certainly are an upgrade in comparison to the Mutsuki, this anti-air armament isn't enough to protect yourself reliably from incoming aircraft, but does provide a little bit of an improved deterrent from patrol boats if they were to surprise you, as your main armament has a rather poor rotation and thus can't react quickly to sudden threats. As for the explosive ordnance, Ayanami gets 18 torpedoes, these being in 3 triple launchers along the center line of the ship, each getting a full reload. Ayanami also carries 8 depth charges, these can be equipped separately or together. The depth charges are useless as is to be expected. The torpedoes are the same as on Mutsuki, both with and without the torpedo modification. The torpedo reloads are found near the base of the front smoke funnel, and on the left side of the vessel near the base of the super firing rear turret. These being very vulnerable means that your left side is more prone to exploding to enemy fire than your right side, so keep this in mind when you use Ayanami in a battle. Maneuverability-wise, Ayanami is a bit slower than Mutsuki with a top speed of 63 km an hour, but this is not too noticeable. As for survivability, there's also nothing too special to note, other than the vulnerable torpedo reloads. For playstyle, I suggest you kite around objectives and ample cover. There are numerous torpedoes being capable of flooding a choke point or capture point quite well, but at the risk of instant detonation. Ayanami is a bit vulnerable to damage, but can deal a hefty punch in return. The high velocity and single shot damage make you a dangerous opponent, but be sure to take out enemy turrets, as you do not have the rate of fire to win most sustained fights. When outgunned, don't be afraid to turn and sail away at full speed. Most of your firepower is on the rear of your ship, and in these circumstances, smoke screens can actually save you. Stay away from close quarters as you don't have the secondaries to protect you from sudden close-range threats. Pros: decent firepower, good torpedoes. Cons: poor anti-air, vulnerable torpedo storage, and no piercing shells. Verdict: spaded. Ayanami is a cheap vessel to spade, and while Japanese 127s don't have an AP shell, they shouldn't yet be too much of a problem at 4.0. This will most likely be your first taste of what most World War II Japanese destroyers will be like, both present and future. Next up, Yugumo. At 4.3 the main armament is identical to Ayanami in both the guns themselves and the position of the ship, so nothing much to say there. As for the anti-aircraft firepower, there is a slight upgrade where the two twin 13.2mm are instead two twin 25mm, still in the same relative position at the base and forward of the second smoke funnel. These have a further firing range, but their low number makes them rather lackluster. A more noticeable difference is the explosive armament on Yugumo. Armed with 8 still useless depth charges and the legendary long lances, or at least a version of them. There are 16 of them on Yugumo, being split into 2 quad launchers amidships and both having a full reload. These have a long range of 20 km and a top speed of 91 km an hour. These combined with the sizable payload of 627.7 kg of TNT equivalent make this torpedo excellent at sniping convoys, spawn points and choke points. Maneuverability wise, it's only marginally faster than Ayanami at 65 km an hour top speed spaded. The survivability on Yugumo is somewhat better than Ayanami due to her lower profile, but you should still be aware that your torpedoes can detonate when hit, and the increased payload on these torpedoes can only make them more lethal. The torpedo reloads are situated at the base of the front funnel and in between the rearmost torpedo launcher and the rear turrets. As for playstyle, Yugumo is practically identical to Ayanami. You want to stay at range where your high velocity guns perform well and launch your torpedoes at locations with lots of traffic. I recommend at least firing your first salvo as quickly as possible after you spawn to get rid of the spare torpedo storage on your ship, thus decreasing your detonation chances. It's best to launch the second salvo soon too, but you could keep some in reserve just in case you get into a situation where your torpedoes have a high chance of hitting the target. Yugumo is still easily outmatched in sustained firefights, so don't be afraid to sail away at full speed, as most of your firepower is at the rear of the ship. Pros: decent firepower, good torpedoes, decent top speed. Cons: very poor anti-aircraft firepower, vulnerable torpedo storage, no armor-piercing shells. Verdict: spaded. Yugumo is still an early destroyer, in fact it's the only rank 2 in the Japanese blue water tree, so it should be a fast process to spade, though you're more likely to face cruisers. Be sure to use your torpedoes on them, and to not shoot at them if you don't have to, as there's no reason to gain the attention of a dangerous enemy. If you can deal with having no armor-piercing shells and actually having to keep an eye out for aircraft, then Yugumo should be a fun destroyer to spade. And lastly, for the tactical destroyers, Akizuki. At 4.7, Akizuki is very different from most of the Japanese destroyers, as she features 4 turrets of dual-mounted 100mm guns. These have a maximum reload rate of 2.9 seconds with a maxed crew. This is among the fastest reloads of any destroyer, only being beaten by 0.1 of a second by the American ones, which only goes for the ready ammo and then they both have the same fire rate. This is a very drastic change compared to the slow firing with Japanese 127mm guns found on the other destroyers. The reduction in damage per shell is noticeable due to the smaller caliber, but fortunately you still have the excellent velocity on the shells. As for her anti-air, even there's a significant improvement. Her main armament can be used for long-range AA, though with the less than optimal timed fuse high explosive. These are useful when you see a high-altitude bomber, your volume of fire being plenty to shoot it down relatively quickly. A good gunnery crew could even do it for you. And not only does the main armament get an AA upgrade, the small caliber anti-air is significantly improved to a total of 35 barrels of 25mm cannons. These are in 5 triple mounts and 20 single mounts. These don't really have the range to intercept possible attackers before they get close, but there should be plenty to discourage any plane from getting too close. As for the explosive armament of Akizuki, there's the same old depth charges, 16 of them, still useless. But for the torpedoes, Akizuki also gets the Type 93 long lances, but a different version than the ones seen on Yugumo. These have a range of 15 kilometers, the same top speed of 91 kilometers an hour, but where these really shine is the explosive mass. This being a whopping 998.4 kilograms of TNT equivalent. These torpedoes are extremely powerful and can almost guarantee a one-shot on any target. Akizuki carries 8 of these in total, with these being in a single quadruple launcher with a full reload, the reload being just behind the launcher. This is a lesser amount of torpedoes compared to what you can find on the previous two. This restricts your ability to flood choke points, but is still plenty for threatening high-value targets. Survivability-wise, there's nothing of note compared to other destroyers, other than the fact that Akizuki is a very large destroyer. The turrets are also rather easy targets, so don't be surprised when you suddenly take a lot of damage. Maneuverability-wise, Akizuki is a bit slow and sluggish for destroyer standards, having a top speed of 61 km an hour, spaded, and a large size doesn't exactly help. So do try and avoid tight areas where making evasive maneuvers would be difficult. For playstyle, Akizuki is most certainly a gunfighter. The main armament, while small in caliber, has excellent characteristics other than the perhaps slow turret rotation. She is however a large target and not exactly armored. If possible, you want to stay behind the main fleet and use your shell velocity and fire rate to take out high priority targets. Akizuki sadly also doesn't have any kind of armor-piercing shell, and at 4.7 you are very likely to see cruisers. I advise you to not provoke them, as Akizuki's guns cannot deal with them. If you choose to equip torpedoes that fire spread at them, but whatever you do, do not draw their attention. Pros: excellent firepower, good anti-air, good torpedoes. Cons: poor mobility, no armor-piercing shell, subpar survivability. Verdict: spaded. Akizuki is a fine destroyer, but not perfect. The spading process should be relatively fast, so it shouldn't be frustrating, but Akizuki is affected most of any Japanese destroyer by not having any kind of armor-piercing shell. But her qualities make her a lot less vulnerable in a gunfight compared to the previous vessels. But not invincible, just make sure to not get overconfident just because you have good guns. All in all, Akizuki is a very opportunistic gunfighter. She can quickly take apart enemies both on the sea and in the air, but she does not fare well when on the receiving end. There is one more destroyer I want to discuss, this being Shimakaze. She is not a tech tree destroyer, but also not a premium, as squadron vehicles are received stock and can get the spading bonuses from spading them. So let's talk about Shimakaze. Shimakaze is armed with the familiar 127mm guns, 6 in total, and in the same configuration as found in Ayanami and Yugumo. For anti-air, Shimakaze is a bit more beefy compared to these two, having a total of 21 25mm guns in 4 triple, 1 dual and 7 single mounts. There is also, oddly, a single 13.2mm machine gun all the way at the back of the ship. As for explosive armament, here's one of the unique traits of Shimakaze. She carries 8 depth charges, which are still useless, and 15 torpedoes. These torpedoes are the same version of the long lance as on Akizuki, so these have a high payload and come in 3 quintuple launchers with no reload. This means Shimakaze can have the single largest torpedo spread out of any ship in the game. Shimakaze can flood vast areas of the map with torpedoes, and if you know how to set up a spread well, you can reliably get kills. For survivability, there's again nothing really exceptional to look at, other than the vulnerable torpedoes of course. As for maneuverability, here we find the second special trait of Shimakaze. She has a top speed of 76 km an hour. While not the fastest destroyer out there, this speed is exceptionally good for Shimakaze, allowing you to quickly get into optimal positions to launch your devastating torpedoes. For playstyle, I suggest using the high speed of Shimakaze to always stay on the move, drop some torpedoes, fire a few salvos and then quickly duck back into cover, leaving the enemy with no time to properly retaliate. Stay at a safe distance where you can react to incoming fire and dodge appropriately. Shimakaze excels at harassing and kiting enemies, but do try and avoid direct gunfights with other destroyers, as your low fire rate can leave much to be desired. Pros: decent firepower, decent anti-aircraft firepower, excellent torpedoes, high top speed. Cons: no armor-piercing shell. Verdict: consider it. Shimakaze is a completely optional vehicle to acquire and is a bit more expensive to spade than the other Japanese destroyers. She does have good economic modifiers and would be a nice destroyer to have in your lineup, but she is not essential for your grind through the Japanese Navy. And that's it for the Japanese destroyers. I'm sorry it took me a while to make this video, but I'd rather make sure that what I say is actually my experience with the ships and not my rose-tinted memories with them. All in all, Japanese destroyers rely both on their guns and torpedoes to do damage, so you can't really ignore either. This makes them a bit rough on the newer players, and their lack of armor-piercing shells doesn't help this. If you personally find the volatile torpedo detonations a bit too frequent, then you could just not equip them, but I find that it then takes away an integral part of their playstyle. Something of note is that Japanese destroyers are a very popular choice for arcade, as torpedoes travel much faster in it and have reloads. I believe they even go 3 times as fast as they do in realistic. In the next video I'll be going over all the Japanese light and heavy cruisers. This will probably take a while, so bear with me. Goodbye, and may the seas be calm.